A tank surfacing in a river, an elixir of immortality found in a grave, or a Russian plane found in a desert. Make yourself comfortable. Here are 7 improbable things found by chance in the 4 corners of the world. Anders Franzén was a Swedish archaeologist and naval engineer with a passion for recovering huge ships lost in the oceans. One of his main career goals was to recover the wreck of the warship Vasa, which ran aground in the middle of the ocean on its maiden voyage. This ship was built in the 17th century under the orders of King Gustav II Adolphus of Sweden. Unfortunately, on August 10, 1628, in the middle of its voyage, the imposing ship was hit by a strong gust of wind, which took its toll. Thus, Anders spent a good part of his career recovering the wreck of the Vasa. He was one of the last men to tackle this gargantuan project. After a long search for the ship's location and the deployment of colossal resources to raise the wreck deep in the water, the Vasa was raised 333 years after the first recovery attempts, using steel cables connected to a hoisting crane. But before returning to the surface, he had to spend years preparing the wreck, digging 6 tunnels under the hull, and making 1,300 dives, all with almost no visibility. After the ship was raised from the water, it was placed in dry dock to await archaeological excavations in its bowels. The Vasa is now on display at the eponymous museum in the city of Stockholm. And even though Anders Franzén is no longer with us, I'm sure he must feel proud in his grave to have accomplished a historic feat. For those who don't know SpaceX, it is an American company specialized in the field of astronautics and spaceflight. It is the company behind the Falcon 9 rocket launchers. Moreover, this agency is one of the few private providers that NASA works with. One of the company's strategies is to reuse the rocket launch vehicle nose cones, mainly for economic and practical purposes. Recently, in an effort to gently recover the nose cone of a Falcon 9 rocket, the company mobilized, as usual, its boats at sea, equipped with large nets. Usually, the company only manages to catch 1 out of 2 or has to fish them out at sea. But this time, SpaceX finally managed to catch both parts of its Falcon 9 rocket's nose cone for the first time ever, during the Onassis 2 mission from Cape Canaveral, Florida. The mission was to deploy a military communications satellite in orbit for South Korea. The launch went well since the satellite was not only deployed at the desired altitude, but the first stage of the launcher was recovered, along with the fairing. Quite a feat. But it was not enough to be able to recover the pieces of Falcon 9. It was especially necessary to recover them in good condition in order to be able to reuse them. And for that, SpaceX had to deploy a lot of effort so that the 800 kilograms fairing does not fall into the water. To ensure correct positioning, the boats tracked the position of the caps with a GPS. And to prevent them from piercing the net and crashing into the barge on landing, their fall was braked by small steering thrusters. By now, SpaceX must surely have positioned its caps in other rockets, and who knows, maybe they are already somewhere in the atmosphere. While Saddam Hussein was alive and, on the run, U.S. forces were driven by the hunt for him and the desire to get him. But the former Iraqi statesman was not the only concern of American soldiers. Indeed, they were moving heaven and earth to get their hands on the untraceable weapons of mass destruction that Saddam had buried. This was one of the primary reasons for the American intervention in Iraq. In 2003, the U.S. military discovered MiG-25 Foxbat and Su-25 aircraft buried under the hot desert sand near Baghdad. Iraq's reason for hiding its fighter planes was purely political. Shortly before the start of the First Gulf War, the country entrusted Iran with the majority of its aircraft in the hope that one day they would be returned to them, in order to avoid using them against American forces. For although they were of Soviet design, they stood no chance against the combined might of America and its acolytes, who had better planes and more skilled pilots. So by handing over its planes to Iran and burying the rest in the desert, Iraq was able to preserve some of its air force and avoid losing it to American forces that would never think of attacking Iran. And it was only by chance, during the Iraqi invasion that took place in the Second Gulf War, that the American army was able to come up against these buried planes. It took a lot of effort to get monsters of that size out of their sandy prison, especially since these fighter planes were no longer of much use when they were discovered. The U.S. military had to scrap what was left of the planes stripped of their wings and the remaining equipment in the wake of the war. These planes may not have been used in the war, but they will certainly help archaeologists interested in the history of the Gulf War. One day, in the high Swiss Alps, three young climbers were enjoying the indescribable feeling of emptiness, calm, and zenitude that nature offered them. While walking on the Gaoli Glacier, the three young people discovered something incredible: a huge pile of scrap metal engulfed in the ice, half melted. Intrigued by such a discovery, the mountaineers stopped at what seemed to them, at first sight, to be an airplane carcass. In order to find out for sure, the three young mountaineers started to carry out superficial excavations to finally discover cans and spoons, which the military aircraft was carrying at the time. It later turned out to be Dakota 53, an American plane that took off from Munich on November 19, 1946, on its way to Marseille. On board were 12 people, including generals and their wives. In the middle of the journey, the plane lost its course over the Alps due to fog and wind. The plane managed to land without too much damage between two rock faces of the Gaoli Glacier, at an altitude of 3,350 meters. Immediately after the rescue operation, a heavy ice storm prevented the plane from being towed away, and it ended up being completely buried under the snow and forgotten over time. Several decades later, it was these three young people who found it, thanks in particular to the melting of the snow due to the high temperatures that the region was experiencing. It was very difficult for them to identify the plane at first, since it had almost no trace of its name, except for some inscriptions on the wings and propellers which were almost destroyed. The young climbers then reported their discovery to the authorities, who were quick to keep an eye on the plane's remains to ensure that they were not stolen. According to an archaeologist in Bern, the Americans are very interested in the remains of the plane. Whether the Swiss keep the plane or not, these three Swiss climbers will always have the right to boast about having made such an impressive discovery. On September 27, 1942, the gigantic Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighter plane left Landvetter. On board was Lieutenant Robert F. Elliott, then 24 years old, from Rich Square, North Carolina. The military plane was on its way to a shooting practice that day. After climbing to 6,000 feet, with about an hour to go, the plane's left engine lost all power. Sometime later, while attempting to reach the airfield, the right engine failed. The aircraft then made an emergency landing on a beach in North Wales in 3 feet of water. The damage caused by the emergency landing and the seawater was so severe that the plane had to be salvaged, but nothing was done and the plane lay buried under 2 meters of sand for several years. Until it was first observed in the 1970s, a second time in 2007 by a family of walkers, and for the last time in 2014. The plane has been stripped of its weapons but still retains its fuel. Its carcass, meanwhile, has had a hard time surviving the vagaries and vicissitudes of the sea. Today, the plane is covered by the law on the protection of military relics. Those who are passionate about its history frequently travel to check its condition, to prevent criminals from disturbing the site in any way or looting it of its historical artifacts. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, much more than a wrecked aircraft, has become a true protected historical object in the UK. Paul Hepler, a ship's captain, used to go on marine expeditions to make discoveries. One day in 1985, while mapping the ocean floor with his pressure gauge, Paul saw 2 huge metal objects lying 28 meters deep in the water. These were 2 Planet Class 2T locomotives from the 1850s. These very rare models had not been manufactured in large quantities as they had become obsolete only a short time after their manufacture. Many questions have arisen as to their presence in the middle of the ocean. Explorers believe that the locomotives were deliberately pushed into the water so that the ship carrying them would not sink from the weight and storm. To correctly identify the 2 locomotives was not an easy task for the captain. The 2 huge engines, each weighing 15 tons, had been underwater for more than a century. The steam engines were encrusted with rust, algae, and barnacles that had accumulated over the years. Today, Paul Hepler has turned over his find to the principals involved, who are working with the New Jersey Museum of Transportation to develop a plan to bring the locomotives to the surface and have them restored. That little marine expedition in 1985 changed his life forever. In Patriot Park located in Kubinka, Russia, archaeological specialists are on a mission to go in search of old military weapons to display in the museum within the facility. The latter, opened in 2016, was designed around the military theme. While trying to carry out excavations around the Don River, these specialists discovered a complete Soviet tank, which emerged from the water on its own, after spending more than 60 years at a depth of 6 meters. It was a T-34 tank, a 30-ton machine that was used during the Second World War. This discovery is incredible, especially since all tanks of this type were destroyed during the battles against Nazi Germany in the early years of the war. It is said that it was driving along a bridge when it broke, causing it to sink to the bottom of the river. Park archaeologists, with the help of soldiers from the Western Military District of Russia and several divers, retrieved the tank from the murky river bottom. After a phenomenal effort to get the tank out of the water, the Patriot Park specialists removed all the dirt from the tank. They then transferred it to the park to begin the process of repair and restoration, as the tank remained in surprisingly good condition. The park employees are obviously proud of having made such a great find, which can only add value to their facility, but they would be even prouder if it could start humming again. So what do you think of these 7 unlikely things found in the world? Give us your opinion in the comments. If you like this video, don't forget to give us a like, subscribe to the channel, and if you still haven't done so, turn on the bell to receive all the notifications and not miss out on any of our upcoming content.